the argument that says, Narvison's kind of argument that we've done nothing wrong to the poor is to say, well, we do have these duties not to violate their human rights, not to contribute to their unjust impoverishment, and that's, Pogge wants to argue, what we're doing. So the next question is, well, how does he think that we're doing that? What way are we doing that? And there's quite a lot of empirical argument in that chapter, quite detailed. I won't go into all the details, but he talks about shared institutions that we have that cause or perpetuate poverty. I think this was raised in some of the discussion we had earlier. So what are these shared institutions? Well, one of them is what is sometimes called the global economic order, which we can also think of in terms of the trading arrangements, and a lot of people over the years have targeted the World Trade Organization as basically the repository of these trading arrangements. And some years ago, there were very active protests whenever the World Trade Organization met, starting in 1999 when they met in Seattle. And the organizers there were caught by surprise by extensive street protests, which actually prevented delegates from getting to some of the meetings. It was a pretty chaotic scene. And they were concerned on a variety of grounds about what the World Trade Organization was doing, both environmental grounds, part of it, and part of it about the claim that it was perpetuating global poverty or was unfair to developing countries. Since then, the WTO meetings have often been held in places where it's much harder to organize protests, and they haven't really been disrupted. But at the same time, some of the developing countries, or the middle-income countries, the BRIC nations, Brazil, India, and China, and so on, particularly Brazil, have led more resistance to the suggestions made by the more developed nations, in particular North America and Europe, and have therefore that rounds of WTO negotiations have not actually made much progress in recent years, and perhaps that's also one reason why people are protesting less. So one question about this is, though, do these arrangements actually perpetuate poverty or do they reduce poverty? And that's a big economic argument, which I certainly can't go into. A lot of people say that the World Trade Organization has reduced poverty by increasing free trade, and that countries like China are an example of countries that have dramatically reduced the number of people living in extreme poverty precisely because they've been able to trade freely. On the other hand, there's some evidence that, and Pogge gives this evidence in his article, that although people, if you like, in the lower middle income range have definitely improved by being able to participate in global trade, and this would be people particularly in China, India, Brazil. The very poorest, the poorest 10% of the world's population has not gained in the same way because they've not really been able to enter into world trade and benefit from it. But Pogge actually has a higher standard, as you can see from this thing here. Pogge says, even if in fact even the lowest tenth have benefited, the question is, they are still in poverty and they could have benefited more. So it's not for him a sort of either or, the arrangements have made them better off or worse off. It's rather, we could have constructed arrangements, other feasible arrangements, that would have done better in reducing poverty and therefore would have lifted more people out of poverty. And if that's so, he argues, we're violating the human rights of those who could have been lifted out of poverty by other arrangements that would have been reasonable for us and for them, but we've not done so. But I want also to look at some of the more specific claims about how we've made them worse off. And this idea of the resource curse is one of them. You've probably heard the expression blood diamonds, and the idea here is that sales of diamonds from places like the Congo have fueled civil war. Because there were rich sources of diamonds, it therefore became possible for people to try to control those areas, for, again, rebel bands or militias to control those areas where the diamonds were and to sell them to the affluent world, therefore to get more arms and therefore to foster more civil war and more strife, which of course makes it very difficult for people in those countries to have decent infrastructure and to escape poverty. So what's our responsibility here? Well, you would say our responsibility is that we are buying the diamonds. If there were no markets for these blood diamonds, then we would not be fueling the civil war in that way. And there have been some moves from diamond producers to try to certify diamonds as not coming from these areas where they're fueling civil war. So that problem has been recognised to some extent, but this is only one and perhaps a relatively small, even if dramatic, example of what's called the resource curse. And it's worth distinguishing two kinds of resource curses. There's the economic resource curse, which is simply the economic fact that if you have poor countries that have a lot of natural resources, the natural resources tend not actually to make them more prosperous. You would think that if you're a poor country and you find a lot of oil or gold or diamonds, you're going to become wealthy. People are going to become much better off. But in fact, it typically does not work that way. So one of the problems is you've now got something that you can export, but it's generally not labour intensive. You can't employ much of the population doing it. And because you have a lot of exports, your currency is going to be overvalued, and therefore your more labour-intensive manufacturing industries, let's say a textile industry would be an example, is not going to be able to compete, because when your currency is overvalued, your goods actually become more expensive. So there's an economic problem there with relying on natural resources. You might say, well, that's nobody's fault. The government ought to take care of that by putting quotas, perhaps, on the amount of the natural resource that can be exported, so that the currency doesn't rise too much and other people can work. So that's one version of the resource curse. But there's also a political version of it, which Pogge has written about in other writings. And that is that very often these resources, when they're in poor countries, are actually in countries that are ruled by repressive and corrupt governments. And we know that the revenue from these natural resources are not going to the people of the country as a whole. They're going into the pockets of the dictator or the government. Perhaps they're going into his Swiss bank accounts. Perhaps they're going to buy more weapons for his army so that you can make sure that no popular resistance movement has any chance of unseating him. And the result is that we are propping up governments that are not interested in the well-being of their people, and effectively, therefore, our support of that contributes to that kind of government. So here's one example of such a country. It's a very small country as it happens, Equatorial Guinea, population just 700,000, but it's the third largest sub-Saharan oil producer. Well, you'd think 700,000 people and they're a big oil producer, surely they're all pretty well off. I mean, they ought to be like the Persian Gulf, some of the Persian Gulf states, like the Emirates, for example, all very well off. And actually their GDP per capita, when you look at it, this is an average, of course, is very high. But then look at some of these other figures. Their life expectancy at birth is only 63, not the worst in the world, but towards the bottom, 184th out of 221 nations. Their infant mortality is dreadful, 73 out of every 1,000 live births. The US is 6 out of every 1,000, and the US is not particularly good on this index, by the way. I think Singapore is the best at 1.85 out of every 1,000, so we're a lot worse than that. But this Equatorial Guinea is one of the worst. This goes the other way by the scale. On this scale, you want to be 222nd. Singapore is 222nd. The number one is the one with the highest rate of infant mortality. The percentage of GDP spent on education is lamentable. Less than 1% of GDP is spent on education. The US spends more than 5% and is not the best either. And the Human Development Index rating, which is a rating of health and income and education, also does very poorly. Well, the reason for this is, as you've guessed from what I've said, that this is a dictatorship. It's been run by this dictator, Teodoro Obiang, for a very long time now. Although they have had elections of a sort, it's pretty clear that the elections are not free and fair elections. He pays himself a relatively modest annual salary, but somehow he manages to live this very luxurious lifestyle, as you can see, with lots of private planes, homes in this country as well as in other countries, all sorts of expensive luxury cars, and a lot of money transferred into various banks. Now, where does the money come from? Well, it comes from some rather familiar names. Not only from these ones, there are foreign oil companies as well, but these are the oil companies that if you drive a car, you're quite likely to be filling your tank with. So the question here is, are we contributing to this? Are we complicit in this? In the wealth that is coming out of the oil wells of this country not being returned to the people of the country. And you could liken this in a way to receiving stolen goods. It's a crime if you know that goods are stolen and you buy them off somebody who you know has stolen them. That's a crime. You can go to prison for that. I think there's a reasonable sense in which Obiang, who seized power in a coup and has never, I think, been fairly re-elected, is stealing oil from the people of his country, from the people living there now and from future generations of his country. But we, perhaps in ignorance, pump it into the tanks of our cars and enable him to continue to do that. So that can be seen as one way in which we're violating the rights of the poor in Equatorial Guinea and in other countries where similarly natural resources are not returned to the people of the country from whom they come. So that would be one way in which I think you could support Poggy's argument of a specific rights violation. He says we either, remember that slide said we intend, foresee, or should foresee. So I suppose for most of us this would have to be the should foresee, but it requires a certain level of information and education to get people to know this. And most people, when you talk to, don't know it in advance, but it's something that you could say ought to be more widely known and publicised. And at least some of the people obviously involved, those running the oil companies, do know about what's going on, and presumably there are people in government who know about it as well. So that's one example that I think is a reasonably specific one. Here's another way in which I think you could say the affluent nations are harming the poor. This is fish stocks. So fish in the oceans are a common resource. The oceans are a commons. Nobody owns the oceans beyond the territorial boundaries of specific nations. And therefore people, anybody can go and fish in those oceans. Now, probably, as you do know, that fish stocks have been declining. There's lots of discussion about various fish stocks. The first big one to collapse was the Atlantic cod fishery, which collapsed in the 1950s and 60s and has never really recovered. But there's a lot of other stocks around the world. Once that one ceased to exist, ceased to be commercially viable, the big international trawlers moved on and started exploiting other fish stocks. And there, as you see, the decline is pretty steady. The dotted line obviously is a projection, and we hope that something will be stopped rather than the extrapolated long-term trend. But it's certainly been declining, and that has already had an effect on poor coastal villages which depend on fishing. Because even if the trawlers don't come into the territorial waters, the fish move. The fish obviously don't know the territorial boundaries, so if you send international trawlers that scoop up the fish outside the territorial boundaries, and they're of course being sold to affluent nations, you don't sell them to people living in poverty because they've got no money to buy them. So essentially we're taking fish from the oceans for people who are already very well fed, and therefore there are fewer fish in the coastal waters where the coastal villages would fish for them. And this is particularly clear, for example, around the coast of West Africa. If you think of the map of Africa, that sort of curving area that sticks out to the west, which is just below Europe, just below countries like Spain. And they've been very heavily fished by international fisheries, mostly selling them to Europe. And one result of that, in fact, is a lot of illegal immigration into Europe by people in North Africa. And when at least some of these people have been asked, why are they leaving? Why are they taking very risky voyages in small boats to get from Africa to Spain? They say, well, I come from a fishing village. We used to have a decent living fishing, but the fish have gone now, so I have no choice. So that's another specific way in which I think you could say we are harming the poor, we are violating the rights of particular groups. We will be talking about this rather more. Climate change is also something that is largely caused by the affluent nations, and yet the people who are most seriously affected by it generally are people from the poorer nations who rely on rainfall to grow their crops. So there are a variety of ways, I think, in which even if we think the argument about the global economic order as a whole is one that is difficult to really assess because the facts and the economic arguments are so complicated, I think there are ways in which you could argue that if we accept the notion of human rights that is incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Rights and that has been further refined in other international documents, which is really what POGI is working with, then on that basis I think POGI does make out a case that we are contributing to, in various ways, we being again the affluent nations as a whole, human rights violations. And that raises the question, so what should we be doing about this? If this is true, then obviously as citizens we should try to change these unfair practices. So as citizens we should be supporting any movements to change the sorts of things that I've talked about. So for instance, to try to develop agreements that we won't buy resources from dictators who do not put the proceeds that they're receiving into improving the well-being of the country as a whole. That we should change unfair trade rules. I haven't really talked about them very much, but POGI talks about them quite a bit. And perhaps we should increase effective aid to compensate for some of the harms that we have already caused. Now, part of the problem here is that the movements to make these changes in this country are not really very strong. So while certainly you should say we should use these democratic processes and we should support groups that are trying to form, it's, I'd say we're still quite a long way off succeeding in these movements. So there are organisations we can support to do this. And then there's the question of compensation, which POGI talks about. So he suggests we should compensate the poor for the harm we are doing to them. So rather than perhaps say, I'm going to find out which oil companies buy gas from dictators who don't help the poor, and then I'm going to avoid buying my gas from those oil companies, which might not really leave you too much in the way of options if you want to drive at all. He should say, well, we could compensate them. We could compensate them by donating to the global poor. And he actually, a few years ago, he suggested a particular amount, which obviously would increase if you're earning more than this. It's a percentage. So there's a figure there in terms of what you might feel to make up for your rights violation you ought to be giving. So that's a way in which it's an independent argument from the one that I gave you before. Okay, so that I think indicates that alternative argument relating to global poverty that I'd like you to think about, and I think Pogge's article makes a strong case for it, and the reading by Leif Wannier backs that up in many respects. And then there are some criticisms, if you want to go into that further, in the Cohen reading that is in the additional readings.